In the earliest cradles of civilization, amidst the dusty plains where the Euphrates whispered secrets of forgotten epochs, the Sumerian temples stood as towering monoliths of both awe and terror. Within these sacred precincts, an elite cadre of priests held sway over the destinies of mortals, wielding not merely the authority of the gods, but the terrifying power to bend the human soul to their will. Yet it was the lunar priestesses, revered for their ethereal connection to the moon's phases, whose lives became the most fragile instruments of this divine tyranny. They were selected, often at tender ages, for their supposed purity and spiritual sensitivity, their fates intricately bound to the celestial cycles that dictated both the fertility of the land and the whims of the temple hierarchy. To the outside world, these priestesses were exalted, cloaked in fine linens, and adorned with silver and lapis, walking embodiments of divine grace. But behind the gilded facade, a more sinister reality unfolded. Within the shadowed corridors of these sanctuaries, where flickering oil lamps cast grotesque shapes upon walls inscribed with sacred texts, the priests exercised an authority that blurred the line between devotion and domination. Rituals, ostensibly designed to honor the gods, frequently masked acts of coercion and control, leaving the priestesses ensnared in cycles of fear and obedience. Every gesture, every whispered chant carried the weight of expectation. Every deviation could summon punishment, social exile, or worse. It was a world where the holy and the horrific coexisted, where the sacred chants of the moon were intertwined with the dark machinations of human desire. And yet, the priests' power was not solely spiritual. They were the arbiters of life and death, controlling grain stores, temple wealth, and political alliances. Their influence permeated the city-states, ensuring that obedience within the temple reverberated into every aspect of society. For such the lunar priestesses, their celestial wisdom did not shield them from the temporal cruelty of the priests' designs. They became pawns in a complex game of dominance, their roles crafted as much by ritual necessity as by the insatiable appetite for control that defined the temple elite. The very architecture of the sanctuaries, narrow chambers, hidden passages, and secluded courtyards, served as both stage and prison, facilitating acts of ceremonial grandeur that doubled as instruments of psychological manipulation. And while their presence was celebrated in hymns and poems, the truths of their suffering were deliberately erased from public memory, leaving only whispers among the scribes who dared to record them. It is within this harrowing interplay of reverence and repression that we begin to glimpse the unimaginable, a society in which holiness became a vessel for exploitation, and in which the lunar priestesses, shining as beacons of divine connection, were simultaneously ensnared by a darkness far more human than celestial. Understanding this grim foundation is essential, for it sets the stage for the deeper horrors concealed behind the temple walls, the rituals whose shadows stretched long across generations, and the human cost of power cloaked in sanctity. If the weight of this revelation unsettles you, pause and reflect, and consider sharing your thoughts below. Like and subscribe, so we can continue to uncover these buried truths together. Ritual and power in Sumerian society were inseparable, a symphony of devotion that orchestrated every facet of daily life. The temples were not merely places of worship, they were instruments of societal control, where the lines between spiritual guidance and authoritarian dominance blurred into a seamless, almost invisible, oppression. The lunar priestesses, whose roles seemed ethereal and exalted, were in reality tethered to a system designed to extract absolute obedience. Their training began early, and eviter indoctrination masked as enlightenment, involving meticulous study of sacred texts, ceremonial duties, and the strict adherence to hierarchical codes. Every chant, every movement within the temple was a lesson in submission, teaching them that their bodies and minds were vessels for the priesthood's will. The priests dictated not only their rituals, but their very existence, controlling interactions, arranging marriages, and determining social standing. In some cases, the lunar priestesses were deliberately isolated, forced to live in temple quarters away from family and friends. Their only social bonds, those sanctioned by the clergy. This isolation magnified the priest's control, ensuring that the priestesses' loyalties were unchallenged and that their dependence on the temple's structure remained total. Beyond the human element, the rituals themselves were intricately tied to cosmic cycles, particularly the phases of the moon. The priestess's connection to these celestial patterns was exploited, presenting an illusion of divine favor while subtly reinforcing the hierarchy's dominance. Every new moon and full moon brought ceremonies that both celebrated and subjugated, reinforcing the priestly authority and reminding the priestesses of their vulnerable positions. These ceremonies often involved complex symbolic acts that demanded precision and complete compliance, testing their endurance, obedience, and loyalty under the guise of piety. The temples also served as centers of economic and political power. Grain storage, land management, and the redistribution of wealth were all controlled by the priests, intertwining spiritual authority with material control. The lunar priestesses, despite their perceived status, had little autonomy over their own lives, their existence inextricably linked to the priest's strategic machinations. The societal reverence for the moon and its emissaries masked a darker reality. The rituals that elevated them publicly also entrenched their subjugation privately. Through these orchestrated ceremonies, the priests reinforced a narrative in which the priestess's value was tied to their compliance, ensuring that the veneer of sacred service concealed a rigid, oppressive structure. It is within this delicate but sinister balance of power and ritual that the true complexity of Sumerian religious life emerges, illustrating how devotion was manipulated into domination and reverence into a tool for control. Here, in these silent chambers, the seeds of fear and obedience were sown, setting the stage for horrors that would remain hidden from the untrained eye, but would shape the fates of the lunar priestesses for generations. Within the labyrinthine halls of the Sumerian temples, the lunar priestesses were entrusted with secrets that transcended ordinary knowledge, secrets that the outside world could scarcely imagine. These sanctuaries were repositories of ancient wisdom, astronomical observations, divination techniques, and ritual prescriptions, but access to such knowledge came at a grave cost. The priestesses, though outwardly venerated, were subjected to exercises and ceremonies designed to test their loyalty and endurance, ensuring that every revelation they possessed was inseparably linked to the priest's authority. The sacred texts, inscribed meticulously on clay tablets, were often cryptic, requiring not only intelligence but compliance. Misinterpretation or hesitation could provoke the priest's scrutiny, subtle punishments, or public censure. The hidden chambers, where incense smoke curled in ghostly patterns, were stages for rites that merged celestial observation with human manipulation. Here, the priestesses' minds and bodies were instruments for the priest's complex designs, each ritual a calculated act of control disguised as spiritual service. They learned to chant, to perform intricate dances, and to maintain the precise timing dictated by lunar cycles. But these tasks were never neutral. Every gesture reinforced the hierarchy, binding the priestesses to a cycle from which few could escape. The secrecy of these practices also extended to moral boundaries. The priestesses were expected to embody purity and devotion, yet within these walls, the line between sanctity and exploitation blurred. The rituals demanded obedience even when they encroached upon personal autonomy, testing their resilience and their capacity to internalize the priest's authority as divine will. Simultaneously, these ceremonies were a spectacle of spiritual grandeur. The temple glowed with torchlight, reflecting off polished stone, the air heavy with the scent of oils and sacred herbs, the chants of the priestesses resonating with a power that seemed otherworldly. For the populace outside, these rituals were awe-inspiring, reinforcing the perception of divine hierarchy and the priestess's exalted role. Yet beneath the luminous exterior, the priestesses' experiences were often suffused with fear, coercion, and isolation. Their knowledge, which might have been liberating, became a tool of entrapment. The deeper one descended into the temple's chambers, the more evident it became that wisdom and oppression were intertwined. Every secret revealed, every incantation mastered, was simultaneously a testament to their capabilities and a reinforcement of their subjugation. In this shadowed interplay of enlightenment and control, the lunar priestesses existed as both emissaries of the gods, and prisoners of human ambition. The layers of secrecy and ritual created a world where devotion was weaponized, and the very knowledge that could have empowered them became a mechanism to bind them ever tighter to the priest's will, setting the stage for abuses that history has only begun to uncover. The evidence of abuse within the Sumerian temples is chilling, yet historians have managed to piece together fragments of what the lunar priestesses endured. Records carved into clay tablets hint at punishments meted out for perceived disobedience, secrecy violations, or failure to perform rituals flawlessly. The priest's control extended beyond spiritual guidance. It became a pervasive instrument of fear and exploitation. Whispers among the scribes recount that priestesses were sometimes confined to isolated chambers for days, forced into rituals that pushed both physical and mental limits. The ceremonial attire, meant to signify divine connection, also acted as a visual reminder of vulnerability, emphasizing their role as objects of the priest's power. In some cases, the very rituals celebrated publicly concealed acts that were deeply coercive. The priest's understanding of the celestial cycles, of the moon's phases, and their supposed influence on human emotion was weaponized against the priestesses, with specific ceremonies timed to maximize compliance and suppress resistance. Evidence also suggests that some rituals were designed to test obedience through humiliation or exposure, leaving the priestesses trapped between duty to the gods and the demands of men cloaked in spiritual authority. Even when performing acts of devotion, their autonomy was a mirage. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance and manipulation was profound. The priestesses' identities became intertwined with the will of the clergy, their own desires subordinated to an all-encompassing system of control. It is within these walls that devotion mutated into oppression, where the sacred was used to justify cruelty. Every hymn sung in honor of the moon carried undertones of constraint, every offering a silent reminder of the cost of non-compliance. The layers of control were subtle, yet devastating, leaving no clear escape for those caught within the temple's grasp. Understanding the horrors embedded in these rituals forces a reconsideration of the Sumerian temples not merely as centers of spirituality, but as arenas of human exploitation. If the darkness of these revelations unsettles you, share your thoughts below in the comments. Your perspective helps illuminate the shadowed corners of history and it is through dialogue that we confront truths long obscured. The priests' influence over the lunar priestesses extended far beyond rituals, permeating the political and social fabric of Sumerian city-states. They were not merely spiritual guides. They were power brokers, manipulating alliances, controlling wealth, and ensuring that the temple remained the central axis of authority. The priestesses, despite their elevated status in religious ceremonies, were entangled in this web of influence, their positions leveraged to consolidate the priest's dominance. Marriages, alliances, and appointments within the temple often required priestly approval, reducing the priestesses to instruments of strategic planning rather than autonomous actors. The priests understood that by controlling the priestesses, they could extend their reach into every household, every city council, and every economic transaction. Grain distribution, temple offerings, and land management all flowed through their hands, tying the population's dependence directly to the temple's authority. The lunar priestesses, while revered for their connection to celestial rhythms, were simultaneously used as symbols of obedience and compliance, their every movement and ritual choreographed to reinforce the existing hierarchy. In private, the priests exercised meticulous control, shaping their behavior, restricting communication, and punishing any hint of dissent. By entwining spiritual reverence with political and economic power, the clergy created a society in which obedience was both a religious duty and a social imperative. The temple's architecture, designed with hidden corridors, observation chambers, and restricted access points, further ensured that the priests could monitor and manipulate without detection. It was a subtle, insidious system. The populace marveled at the priestesses' apparent freedom and divine favor, while in reality, their lives were carefully orchestrated to serve the priests' ambitions. Even the rituals celebrating the moon, the very symbol of their supposed authority, were tools for reinforcing their subjugation, reminding them that their exaltation was conditional, contingent upon unwavering compliance. In this way, the temple hierarchy became both a spiritual and political machine, with the lunar priestesses at its core, glorified yet constrained, venerated yet dominated, their celestial symbolism serving as a mask for the very human manipulations that governed their lives. The profound intertwining of ritual, devotion, and political strategy reveals a civilization in which power was meticulously engineered, where religious splendor concealed exploitation, and where the seemingly divine lives of the priestesses were, in truth, instruments of control, extending the priest's reach far beyond the temple walls. The initiations within the Sumerian temples were ceremonies shrouded in secrecy, crafted to impress, intimidate, and enforce total submission. These rites were far from mere displays of devotion. They were meticulously designed instruments of psychological and physical conditioning. The lunar priestesses, at the center of these shadowed rituals, experienced a sequence of ordeals that tested not only their understanding of sacred knowledge, but also their capacity to endure control imposed by the priests. Behind closed doors, the sanctuaries echoed with chants and the measured rhythm of drums, each sound reinforcing the authority of the temple and the priest's dominion over the participants. The priestesses were subjected to complex tasks, often requiring them to navigate rituals blindfolded or under conditions of sensory deprivation, heightening both vulnerability and dependence. Every step was a lesson in obedience. Every error or hesitation could result in reprimand, isolation, or public exposure. Some rites involved symbolic acts that mirrored cosmic events, representing life, death, and rebirth. Yet these acts concealed elements of coercion and intimidation, turning spiritual enlightenment into a mechanism of control. The priests exploited their knowledge of the moon's cycles, aligning initiations with lunar phases to amplify emotional and physical impact, thereby deepening the priestesses' psychological entanglement. Beyond the ceremonial, there were reports of extreme exercises meant to assert dominance and reinforce submission, fasting, exposure to isolation, and tasks that required endurance beyond normal human limits. These experiences were justified as sacred trials, yet their intent was unmistakably coercive, leaving the priestesses physically drained and mentally conditioned to accept hierarchical authority without question. Each ritual reinforced the illusion of divine purpose, while simultaneously tightening the priest's grip over the temple's most vulnerable participants. The environment itself contributed to the power dynamics. Flickering torches cast shadows that distorted perception. Incense smoke created an otherworldly haze, and the very architecture of the sanctuaries guided movement along paths determined by those in power. To the outside observer, these ceremonies might have appeared as elevated spiritual practice, a dance of devotion and cosmic alignment, but within the hidden chambers, fear, obedience, and manipulation reigned supreme. These initiations were not merely rites of passage. They were formative experiences that bound the lunar priestesses to the temple hierarchy, ensuring that even their knowledge, their wisdom, and their insight were inseparable from the priest's authority. In examining these secretive practices, it becomes chillingly clear that the grandeur of Sumerian spirituality was inseparable from the machinery of control and exploitation, leaving the priestesses trapped in a world where holiness and horror were indistinguishable. Even in the shadow of such relentless control, some lunar priestesses sought ways to resist, to reclaim fragments of autonomy within a system designed to suppress them. Their defiance was subtle, almost imperceptible, hidden in gestures, whispered prayers, and clandestine movements that evaded the ever-watchful priests. Within the temple's intricate corridors and secluded chambers, they developed quiet networks of solidarity, exchanging knowledge and offering support to one another without attracting attention. The priest's dominance was formidable, yet the human spirit's desire for freedom manifested in small acts that carried enormous weight. Some priestesses manipulated ceremonial routines to create private moments of reflection. Others found solace in memorizing sacred texts, hiding interpretations that contradicted the official dogma, preserving intellectual autonomy despite the external pressure. Occasionally, subtle disruptions in rituals or deviations in chants served as tiny protests, signaling resistance to the authoritarian grip of the clergy. The priestesses' knowledge of celestial cycles became a covert tool, allowing them to predict the timing of certain tests or ceremonies, giving them a marginal advantage in preserving their well-being. Even these small victories, however, came at great risk. Discovery often led to public reprimand, isolation, or harsher trials, reinforcing the stakes of rebellion within the temple. Yet, these acts of courage, though quiet, demonstrate the enduring tension between oppression and resistance, revealing that human ingenuity can persist even in the darkest of circumstances. The temple's grandeur, the ceremonial splendor, and the priest's calculated authority could never fully extinguish the flicker of agency that persisted among the lunar priestesses. These moments of defiance were also the seeds of stories and memories passed down through generations, fragments of truth that reveal the resilience underlying the elaborate facade of subjugation. Understanding their quiet resistance allows a deeper comprehension of Sumerian society, a civilization where power was absolute yet never uncontested, where the rituals that enforced obedience were mirrored by subtle acts of rebellion that preserved humanity amidst ritualized terror. Share your reflections in the comments below. The courage of these women against overwhelming control is a story that demands to be discussed and remembered. The ramifications of ritual abuse within the Sumerian temples extended far beyond the walls of the sanctuaries, permeating the very fabric of society. The exploitation of the lunar priestesses created a model of normalized authority and obedience, teaching the broader population that submission to hierarchical power was both sacred and inescapable. Communities internalized the lessons performed within the temples. Fear was intertwined with reverence, and the divine was inseparable from coercion. Social structures mirrored the dynamics observed in the sanctuaries, with leaders employing religious and ceremonial justification to maintain control over their citizens. The temple's influence on daily life was profound. It dictated economic cycles, influenced political decisions, and structured educational and familial roles according to rigid hierarchies. The psychological impact on the priestesses radiated outward as well, subtly shaping cultural expectations for gender, obedience, and spiritual purity. The mythos surrounding the lunar priestesses, their devotion, and the trials they endured reinforced a narrative where suffering was sanctified, and resistance was framed as defiance not merely against the priests, but against the gods themselves. This societal conditioning perpetuated cycles of compliance and submission, ensuring that the elite maintained authority and the populace internalized the values of control as divine law. Moreover, the secrecy surrounding the abuses within the temple created a dual reality. The public celebrated the priestesses' celestial alignment, unaware of the manipulations behind the veil, while the priesthood retained unchallenged power. Over time, these patterns contributed to systemic inequalities, where those in positions of religious authority could consolidate influence far beyond spiritual guidance, extending into political, economic, and social realms. The abuses suffered by the lunar priestesses were, thus, not isolated incidents, but integral mechanisms by which the temple cemented societal dominance. In essence, the control exercised in secret within the temples reverberated across generations, shaping Sumerian culture into one where fear, ritual, and authority were inseparable. The story of the lunar priestesses, their suffering, and the societal consequences of their exploitation provides a stark lens through which to view the intersection of religion and power. A civilization where human cruelty was sanctified and obedience was elevated to divine mandate, leaving echoes of oppression long after the rituals ended. When we examine other ancient civilizations, striking parallels emerge that cast the Sumerian temple's abuses into a broader context. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, religious elites often wielded power that blurred the boundary between devotion and domination, though the mechanisms varied. In Egypt, for instance, priestesses and temple women participated in rituals that combined spiritual service with strict oversight, where disobedience could jeopardize both position and life, echoing the Sumerian enforcement of obedience through ritualized control. The Indus Valley shows hints, through limited archaeological evidence, of tightly controlled priestly hierarchies, where access to sacred knowledge was restricted and social status reinforced via religious service. Even in Mesoamerican societies, the sacred duties of women within temple contexts were often bound to rigorous ceremonies that dictated every aspect of personal behavior, mirroring the psychological and societal control exerted by Sumerian priests. What becomes clear is a recurring pattern. Civilizations that revered spiritual intermediaries frequently imposed systems in which holiness was inseparable from hierarchy, and the elite used sacred narratives to justify exploitation and maintain social dominance. The lunar priestess's plight, while extreme, is thus part of a universal phenomenon in which religious institutions consolidated power not solely through faith, but through intricate structures of control, secrecy, and coercion. Across these societies, the lives of women devoted to the divine were simultaneously exalted and constrained, celebrated publicly while constrained privately, a duality that facilitated both veneration and manipulation. The Sumerian case is particularly stark because the combination of political influence, ritualized abuse, and economic control created a society in which resistance was extraordinarily difficult, and suffering became institutionalized. By comparing these civilizations, we gain insight into the broader mechanisms of religious authority, how the sacred could serve as both a beacon of cultural identity and a tool of oppression, shaping not only the lives of the devotees, but the very trajectory of society itself. Understanding these cross-cultural patterns deepens our comprehension of the Sumerian priests' methods, revealing that while the specifics of the rituals were unique, the underlying structures of exploitation were part of a recurring human phenomenon, echoing across time and geography. The legacy of the Sumerian temples is a chilling testament to the interplay of faith, power, and human ambition. The lunar priestesses, whose lives were bound by celestial cycles, endured a reality where reverence was inseparable from subjugation, and devotion became a conduit for manipulation. Their suffering, meticulously hidden behind ritual grandeur and sacred symbolism, reverberates across history as a stark reminder of the human cost of unchecked authority cloaked in holiness. Through the ceremonies, isolations, and subtle psychological manipulations, the priests not only maintained control over the priestesses, but shaped the wider society's understanding of obedience, morality, and divine order. Even centuries later, the echoes of these abuses challenge our perception of spirituality and power, highlighting how systems designed to uplift the soul can be perverted into instruments of domination. The temples, with their intricate architecture, secret chambers, and elaborate rituals, were not merely sites of worship, but arenas where human vulnerability was exploited under the guise of sacred duty. Yet within this darkness, the resilience of the priestesses shines. Moments of quiet defiance and secret knowledge preserved fragments of autonomy that resisted total control. Reflecting on this legacy forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable truths of human nature. Our capacity to sanctify cruelty, to enshrine dominance in ritual, and to blur the line between reverence and exploitation. The story of the lunar priestesses serves as both a warning and a revelation, showing how power, when unchecked, can corrupt even the most sacred institutions. As we uncover these buried histories, it becomes clear that understanding the past is essential to navigating the present. If this exploration of hidden atrocities and celestial subjugation has unsettled, fascinated, or provoked thought, be sure to subscribe, leave your comments, and continue watching. There are countless shadows of ancient history waiting to be illuminated, each story more astonishing and harrowing than the last.